Welcome, friends, to the next in our Bible study series. We're calling this series Faith Under Fire. This is going to be a study of Daniel chapter 11. There is a listening guide for this study, so if you have that if you haven't yet downloaded that listening guide, you can find it at the same place you found this video. You might want to download that listening guide, even print it out. There are some blanks to fill in as we move along through the study. Before we jump into the study, though, let's pray, shall we? Father, these are difficult passages. These are difficult words to understand and to apply, even to receive in some ways. And our prayer is that you will use your word to change how we see the world around us, that you'll use this word to encourage us in the same way that it would have been encouraging to Daniel. Our prayer is that you'll help us to receive these words in the same way that Daniel would have received them, in the way you intended for them to be received. We come to you, Father, in the midst of some uncertain times, difficulties around us in so many ways. First time in a generation that we've experienced these kinds of circumstances as a global pandemic. So our prayer is that you will use your word to comfort us, to center us, to balance us, and to cause us more and more to see the world through your eyes. We love you. We pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. So recall that the subtitle to this unit that we're going through, Faith Under Fire, is learning to trust in the Lord when it feels like the world around us is falling apart. We were catching Daniel in chapter 11, actually chapters 10, 11, and 12, the last three chapters. We were catching him near the very end of his life, and we are seeing in the group of these three chapters together, we're seeing the last vision that the Lord gave him, at least the last one that he wrote down for us. Last week, in chapter 10, we looked at the spiritual warfare going on in the unseen spiritual world around us. And we just learned that it's there, that in many cases it's even more real than the material world that we live in. And we began to see that there is a connection between that spiritual world and the material world. And this week's lesson is going to focus entirely on the material world over the next 150 to 300 years after Daniel. And we're going to see that the warfare that we saw going on last week in the spiritual world has impacts and consequences in the material world, just as our prayer time in the material world has an impact and consequences in that spiritual world. And we're going to see some of those consequences today as we see it all beginning to play out. Recall that Daniel is retired at the time that he has this vision. He's no longer working in the palace. He's probably in his late 80s or early 90s by now, which may explain why he chose not to make the trip back to Jerusalem. We're at a point in time when the people of Israel who were being held in captivity have been allowed to go back home. Many of them have gone back home, and we see that in Ezra and in Nehemiah and the things that happened there. But Daniel did not make the trip back. He stayed where he was. And this is his last vision. I think it's important as we begin to look in chapter 11, though, it's more important than ever before that the question we ask ourselves and the way we approach this lesson is to ask ourselves, how would Daniel have received these words? Because obviously, looking back in history at things that have already taken place, they had not yet taken place for Daniel, we could get caught up and spend hours attaching names and dates and circumstances to everything that's mentioned in these prophecies, at least for the ones that have already taken place for us. We could spend a lot of time doing that, but Daniel wouldn't have been able to do that. Daniel wouldn't have been able to put names and dates on these things, and so the approach that we want to take here is, how was Daniel to receive this? How would these words from God be an encouraging word to Daniel, and how can they also be an encouraging word to us as well? So with that idea, make sure you've got your Bibles open in front of you to Daniel chapter 11. Let's just begin reading. By the way, I'm reading out of the ESV version of the Bible in case yours doesn't read quite the same way. You'll recognize that difference. This is beginning with verse 2 in chapter 11, because last week when we looked at Daniel chapter 10, we came, remember, all the way through chapter 11, verse 1. So now we'll pick up with chapter 11, verse 2. Here's how it sounds. And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, and do as he wills. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. Let's just stop right there at the end of verse 4. And let's recognize that this prophecy is reading a little bit differently than all of the other prophecies and visions that Daniel has had. All of a sudden, we're in the realm of detail here. We're getting actual events and actual details, as opposed to all of the symbols and the rams and floating through the air and the great horns and the little horns and all of those kinds of things. We're not getting that anymore. All of a sudden, God, as he looks forward into the days ahead for Daniel, the message from this angel begins to become very practical and very detailed. And yet, what we're going to see as we begin looking back and being able to recognize some of the things that were prophesied for Daniel, but that are in our history, what we're going to see is that the prophecy is selective prophecy. And by that I mean, remember when we talk about prophecy, we talk about crunching up the timeline so that the timeline does not become quite as apparent. And we look down through all of those timelines, and we see things that, as they are spoken, end up being very near each other, but may not have been very near each other at all. And what we're going to see in this prophecy is selected things. As the angel looks down into that timeline, he's going to select things, and they are in order, but they're not necessarily right up next to each other in our timeline the way they appear in here. So he's picking and choosing, so to speak, the things that seem important to mention in this prophecy. It's a selective timeline. So what we see in these first few verses is we see 4 subsequent Persian kings. And what we know is that's exactly what happened. There were 4 prominent kings, Persian kings, and they were followed by Alexander the Great. And we see the rise of Alexander the Great here in these first few verses. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken. And that's exactly what happened with Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, at an early age, in his early 30s, lost his kingdom. Actually, he died, and his kingdom was divided into 4 regions: the north, the south, the east, and the west. And so those 4 kingdoms ended up with 4 rulers. We had Lysimachus became the ruler of Asia Minor. Cassander became the ruler of Greece. And then we have the north and the south kingdoms. The northern kingdom, which would have been Syria, was ruled by Seleucus, and an entire Seleucus empire was started. And the south kingdom, which would have been Egypt, was ruled by Ptolemy. And an entire Ptolemaic empire would have been started there. And so those are the 4 regions that are talking about. And as we look back in history, we can see that it happened exactly as God said it would. But for now, I just want to stop and recognize that all of these things that we just read, all of these things happened as a direct result of the spiritual warfare that the angel was talking about in chapter 10 that we looked at last week. All of that spiritual warfare, talking about the prince of the north and the prince of the south, and the warfare that was taking place, all of that warfare resulted in what we've just read. And so it's important to see that connection is there. If you have a listening guide with you, let's fill in the first blank on your listening guide now. To believe the Bible means to likewise believe that the rise and fall of nations and their leaders is preordained and brought about by spiritual forces both good and evil, and struggles of which we are unaware. The rise and fall of nations and their leaders is preordained and brought about by spiritual forces, both good and evil, and struggles of which we are unaware. Things in this unseen spiritual world around us that result in the leadership coming into place and in nations rising and falling, just as is ordained from the beginning of time by a sovereign God. All right, so these selective prophecies then begin to unfold for us about the south, that is Ptolemy, that is Egypt, the realm that we know as Egypt, that they even knew at the time as Egypt, and the north, which would be Seleucus, that's the land that we know as Syria. And what we see next is the next 150 years painted with a very broad brush in some cases, but with a very detailed brush in other cases, with unbelievable detail laid out over the next many verses in chapter 11. So beginning with verse 5. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her and he who supported her in those times. Verse 7, and from a branch from her roots one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, and for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. And so that passage that we've just read, verses 5 through 9, that takes us in time right up to the king that, looking back in history, we recognize as Antiochus III or Antiochus the Great in the north, the king of the north. That takes us right up to that. And verses 10 through 19, which I'm not going to take the time to read here, but just know that verses 10 through 19 then continue to move us forward through 150 years of history and take us all the way up to verse 20, which is a reference to one of the very last of the Grecian rulers, Seleucus Philopator. Seleucus Philopator. He was the raiser of taxes. And the reason I'm stopping there and reading it in verse 20 and then explaining it is because it's an interesting story. Verse 20 says, then shall arise in his place one who shall send an tribute, that is an exactor of taxes, for the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days, and as in prophetic language for Daniel anyway, that actually translates within a few years, but within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. And the reason I'm stopping here is because this ruler, Seleucus Philopator, was one of the last of the Grecian kings that arose out of Alexander the Great's empire that was started. And one of the last of the Seleucus Empire. And the Roman Empire by this time was growing so strong that it was in fact exacting taxes against his empire. And in order to pay those taxes, he became known. He put a very complicated and very pervasive tax plan in place across his kingdom in order to raise the money to pay those taxes that the Roman Empire was now exacting from him. And so that, all the way through verse 20, gives us really a remarkably accurate but selective prophecy of the 150 years that was going to follow Daniel. I mean, historians are able, and I'm not going to take the time to do it now. I've been reading history all week long on this, and I'm not going to take the time to do it now, but historians are able to look back and look at every single one of these prophecies. And by the way, in the first 35 verses of Daniel chapter 11, there are well over 100 prophetic statements made that can be verified in history. And you can go back and look at what we've read so far, and historians are able to pin down exactly what he's talking about in a prophetic sense. And it reads beautifully and very, very accurately. So the point is, and remember, we're looking at this from Daniel's perspective. How encouraging would it be to Daniel to know that God has this all laid out? That his sovereign God has it all planned and ordained, and it's going to unfold exactly as he says it's going to unfold. How encouraging is that for Daniel? But how much more so, how encouraging is it for us to be able to read these prophetic words, these predictive words that were written, and look back in history and see that it was exactly 100% accurate all the way through the next 150 years after Daniel? How much more so in retrospect, how much more encouraging is it for us to realize that this God really is sovereign, that he really does know and understand everything, and when he says something's going to happen, it really is going to happen. It illustrates God's sovereignty. So if you've got your listening guide with you, let's fill in the next blank on your listening guide. This is the second statement. The miracle of God's sovereignty is not that he can somehow impose his ultimate will on us. That's not it at all. Rather, it is that we, in all our brokenness, can operate completely out of our own sinful wills, and he will still accomplish his purposes through it. That is, we read in these first 20 verses all of these deceptions and willful mechanisms of kings and of leaders and deals and alliances and all of these things that are going on that are typical of us, typical of the political machinations of powers that be. All of these things that are happening in their own will, and the point is God is using every single one of these things in his sovereignty. He's using every single one of these things in order to accomplish what he desires, in order to accomplish his will and his purposes. God really does, as in Romans chapter 8, God really does cause all things to work together for good for those who love him and for those who are called according to his purpose. He really is amazing. It is a miracle that in his sovereignty, he allows us to make the decisions we make, allows nations to make the decisions they make for good or for bad, good or evil, and he uses those decisions in order to accomplish his will and his purposes. So where we get to now in verse 21 is we pick up with what in previous visions we would refer to as the little horn. Remember the visions about the big horn and the little horn, and how the little horn brought about the abomination of desolation and the desecration of the temple. That little horn that represents two things. In history, it represents Antiochus Epiphanes, but in the future, it represents the Antichrist or someone like the Antichrist. And so we're going to pick up now in verse 21 with a really beautiful rendition of the goings-on of Antiochus Epiphanes, beginning in verse 21. In his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. And he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Verse 26, even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And as for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail. For the end is yet to be at the time appointed, and he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work with his will and return to his own land. What's going to happen next then, beginning in verse 29, is we're going to see that the abomination of desolation is coming at the appointed time, or at the time appointed. And I stop there and just recognize that's a reference to a sovereign God. All of this is unfolding exactly as he intends it to, exactly as he intends for his purposes to be fulfilled. He shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before, for ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. So this loss by Antiochus Epiphanes, this loss and this alarm on his part will turn him against the Hebrew people and against the temple. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Verse 31, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. And when they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end. Remember that phrase right there, until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. What we've just read, these first 35 verses, covers almost 150 years of history. And this last portion that we've read about Antiochus Epiphanes, that just covers a 9-year period of time, from 175 BC to 164 BC. And by history standards, and this is what's interesting, by human history standards, this king, Antiochus Epiphanes, was not really all that significant among the Syrian leaders. He's almost a footnote. He's almost an afterthought in the history of the material world. But as you can see, in the spiritual world, he becomes this prototype, this projection, if you will, backwards of what the Antichrist will be in eschatological times, in the end days. And so in the spiritual world, through God's eyes, God sees him very differently, as much more significant than the way man would have seen him. It's spiritually significant because of the interaction that he has with God's people. It's spiritually significant because of the abomination of the abomination of desolation, this desecration of the temple. It's spiritually significant because it is so much a mirror image of what's going to happen in end times. So again, recognize that in the verses we've just covered, over 100 prophetic statements are verified in history, are statements that were spoken prophetically before they happened, and they happened exactly as they said they would happen as we now look back in history. Biblical prophecies have been perfect so far. Now, we haven't gotten to all of the biblical prophecies in time yet, but of the ones we have gotten to, they have been perfect so far. If you have your listening guide, let's fill in the next blank on your listening guide. The God who is undefeated and whose prophetic word is absolutely perfect so far in history has made some amazing promises to you and to me. Let that encourage you today. It was an encouragement to Daniel that his God, who had never been defeated and who had never been wrong before, was telling him, here's the way it's going to lay out after you're gone, Daniel. Here's the way it's going to unfold. That was an encouragement to him because it was a reminder of the sovereignty of God. It's an encouragement to us to look back and see, yes, it happened all exactly as he said it was going to happen. And that same God is the God who makes promises to us in his word, to you and to me in his word. When God says something, it happens. Exactly as he says, it will happen. What an encouraging word for us. All right, so in verse 35, though, we have this reference to until the time of the end. And that is a tap on our shoulder as we're reading through this. And it was a tap on Daniel's shoulder that what's about to be described, beginning in verse 36, what's about to be described then is going to skip way forward in history to the time of the end. And this is consistent in Daniel. This is consistent with his visions. His visions cover right up to the time of the end of the Old Testament, right up to the time of Jesus coming the first time. And then his visions, for the most part, mostly skip over everything that happens after Jesus and skip all the way up past us, all the way up to the end times. Depending on your millennial view, that last tribulation period of time, those last 7 years of the world as we know it. And that's what verse 36 begins to do. It begins to look forward. And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. It's a very creative transition that's made here from Antiochus Epiphanes to the Antichrist, or someone like the Antichrist, someone at the time of the Antichrist, because Antiochus Epiphanes, this otherwise insignificant leader by the world standards, is an actual projection backwards of what the Antichrist will look like. And so verse 36 just begins this transition towards these eschatological times. Let's pick up now with verse 40. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and with many ships, and he shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land. That's a reference to Israel. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall. But these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. Now, some of this sounds very similar to what it just described about Antiochus Epiphanes, and that's because remember, Antiochus Epiphanes and his rule is just a mirror image of what's coming in the eschatological times, in the end times. And so this is now talking about those end times. Verse 45, and he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. God wins in the end, in other words. There is very little to no correspondence for what we've just covered in verses 36 through 45. There's very little in history to go back and pen these things to, which is another reason why most scholars believe that this passage that we've just read is actually future to us as well. But we're not able to, with all the accuracy, pen down these events the way we were able to pen down the first 35 verses. And so most scholars are in agreement that these verses are a reference to end times. They see this as eschatological. But it does follow this same pattern. This chapter, as God begins to get very detailed, no more symbols, no more animals, he gets very detailed, it still follows the same pattern of 300 years of history after Daniel, and then skipping the age of the church, and then going all the way to the eschatological times. We see in these verses the Great Tribulation. We see the tribulation with its world ruler, with its materialistic philosophy, with its world religion. We see that the world will be deceived, that many, many people will buy into this as a good thing, as a beautiful thing, as a worldwide peace even. And yet, it's a part of the deception that leads us into the time of the tribulation. We'll get more into the tribulation time next week as we get into chapter 12, because chapter 12 really takes a deep dive into those tribulation years, and I don't want to get into that this week. But what I do want to cover is the very last words of verse 45, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. we know as God's people, as Christ followers, we know how this all ends. We know that it's going to get ugly. It's going to get very, very bad. And then God's going to win. And the Antichrist is going to be defeated. And he and all of his demons are going to be cast into the abyss. And God wins and prevails in the end. And we know the end of the story. And so that's another way of encouraging us in the same way that it would have been encouraging to Daniel. If you have your listening guide, let's go ahead and fill in the last blank on your listening guide. There is something positive about circumstances that cause God's people to refocus on what matters. And isn't that exactly what's happened with this pandemic? Circumstances that cause us to refocus on what matters. Long after this pandemic is gone, long after governments and nations rise and fall and are gone, we will be left with the decisions we made about God. Because when it's all over, He still is. He is the great I am. And when everything is done, and the suffering is over, and the nations have risen and have fallen, and the Antichrist has risen and fallen, when it's all over, He still is the great I am. He still is. What an encouragement to us that God is that sovereign, that He can use our flawed decisions to accomplish His perfect will, and that when it's all done, when it's all said and done, He wins, we win, and the New Jerusalem is established, the new kingdom. So much more to get into next week in chapter 12. We will take a deeper dive into those end times. Until then, let's be still and know that He is God. I love you guys. Thanks for studying the Word with me.